The Galactic Compact Emergency Assembly convened at 0600 station time, with representatives from 37 species present, full military attachés in attendance, and the collective weight of 400 years of interstellar diplomacy pressing down on a single agenda item: the Zurani advance on the Helios corridor. The Zurani had taken 3 colony systems in 11 days. Their advance was not fast by galactic military standards. It was precise, which was worse. Each system fell in the exact sequence their tactical models predicted. Each defensive response countered before it was fully formed. Each attempt at coordination disrupted before the first ship moved. The Compact's Joint Military Command had been attempting to organize a response for 6 days, and had produced, so far, a consensus that the situation was serious and a disagreement about everything else. The human delegation arrived 40 minutes late. There was one of them. Commander Hayes Colton walked into the assembly chamber at 0640 carrying a coffee, wearing civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, boots that suggested he had come from somewhere cold, and sat in the human delegation seats, without apparent awareness that every other delegation in the room had been present for 40 minutes and was watching him with a range of expressions from irritation to frank bewilderment. He drank his coffee. He looked at the tactical display. He said nothing. Admiral Catan of the Velthari Dominion, who was chairing the session, said, "Commander Colton, the assembly was called for 0600. "I know," Colton said. "I was reading the engagement logs from the Keth system." He set the coffee down. "The joint response proposal on the table won't work." The chamber was quiet for a moment, in the way that chambers go quiet when someone says something that is either correct or deeply inappropriate. "The proposal," Catan said carefully, "represents 6 days of coordinated planning by the military commands of 14 species." "I know," Colton said. "I read that too." He stood and walked to the tactical display without being invited to, which produced among the assembled delegates a range of responses that the diplomatic record would later describe as varied. The Zurani advance follows a dependency map. Every system they've taken, they took in a specific order, not the order of military value, not the order of proximity, the order of maximum cascade disruption to communication infrastructure. He brought up a schematic that was not the one currently displayed, which meant he had loaded his own materials into the assembly system at some point in the last 40 minutes, which no one had seen him do. They're not conquering systems, they're cutting the cord. Every system they take reduces the Compact's ability to coordinate a response to the next system they take. By the time they reach the Helios corridor, the Joint Command will be operating on 12-hour communication delays. He turned and looked at the room. "The proposal on the table assumes we can coordinate a joint response," he said. "We can't. Not anymore. They've been specifically degrading our coordination capacity for 11 days, and we've been trying to coordinate a response for 6 of them." He paused. "We need a different approach." Counselor Dreskar of the Velthari said, "Commander Colton, you arrived 40 minutes late, alone, without uniform or attaché. The human compact contribution is 3 vessels currently positioned at Threshold Gate 7. On what basis are you proposing to revise a plan developed by 14 military commands?" Colton looked at him. "On the basis that it won't work," he said. "I'm happy to explain why in more detail if that would help." The explanation took 40 minutes and was, by the account of most delegates present, the most uncomfortable 40 minutes of the assembly session. Not because the analysis was wrong, but because it was systematically, specifically correct, in ways that implicated 6 days of joint planning. The Zurani weren't attacking military targets. They were attacking the assumptions underlying the joint response, the communication infrastructure, the coordination protocols, the shared situational awareness that 14 species military commands relied on. The joint response assumed a level of coordination at the Zurani had already degraded below the operational threshold. Executing the plan would require the very capability the plan's execution would fail to restore. "What do you propose instead?" asked Elder Varath of the Aetheri. "Autonomous action," Colton said. "Each species acts independently on its own timeline without coordination. No shared protocols, no synchronized movements, no joint command structure for the Zurani to disrupt." He looked at the room. "They've perfect counter to coordinated response. They haven't built a counter to 14 species doing 14 different things simultaneously without talking to each other." "That's not a military strategy," said the Volmari representative. "That's chaos." "Yes," Colton said. "Controlled chaos is harder to model than coordinated response. And the Surani are very good at modeling coordinated response." He paused. "They've been doing it for 11 days. The chamber erupted, which Colton appeared to have anticipated. He sat down, finished his coffee, and let it happen. Catan called order after 4 minutes. "Commander Colton, you are proposing that the Compact abandon 6 days of coordinated planning in favor of autonomous action by individual species with no shared command structure." "I'm proposing that we use the fact that we can't coordinate as a feature rather than a problem," Colton said. "The Surani have spent 11 days making it impossible for us to act together. What they haven't accounted for is that we might act separately on purpose." "On what timeline?" "Immediately," Colton said, "before they reach Helios. The corridor is the point where their advance becomes irreversible. Once they control it, the communication delay becomes permanent. We have approximately 72 hours. "You said the human contribution is 3 vessels at Threshold Gate 7, Treskar said. "What is the human role in this autonomous action you're proposing?" Colton looked at him steadily. "We go first," he said. "If this story has you hooked, subscribe now and hit the bell. Now, back to it." The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a statement lands in a room and no one is certain whether it is confident or delusional. 3 vessels, Dreskar said, against the force that has taken 3 compact systems in 11 days. 3 vessels moving independently, without coordination signals, without predictable doctrine, against a fleet that has spent 11 days modeling and countering coordinated response. Colton stood. The Zurani tactical model is very good. It is not good at targets that don't behave like military targets. He paused. "We're going to go in looking like we don't know what we're doing. They're going to believe us. And in the gap between what they expect and what actually happens, the rest of you will move." The 3 human vessels departed Threshold Gate 7 at 0300, which was not the time Colton had indicated in the assembly and not the heading he had filed with Compact Traffic Control. Lieutenant Vera Finch, commanding the Pale Horizon, noted this on departure. "The filed heading takes us around the Keth debris field," she said over the command channel. "You've set a course through it." The Keth debris field is 6,000 kilometers of irregular mass creating continuous sensor interference, Colton said from the starfall. It also takes 4 hours longer to go around it than through it. It's also where the Zurani positioned their forward observation units after they took Keth, said Captain Reed Crane on the last signal. "I know," Colton said. "We're going to let them see us." A pause on the channel. Then Crane said, "You want them to track us through the debris field?" "I want them to try to track us through the debris field," Colton said. "Those are different things." What followed over the next 6 hours was something that would later be described in the official compact engagement record as tactically unorthodox, which was the diplomatic language for something that had no precedent in any military doctrine the record keepers could identify. 3 human vessels moving through 6,000 kilometers of sensor-disrupting debris at varying speeds on vectors that changed without apparent logic, producing a sensor signature that the Zurani observation units, designed to track military vessels following military movement patterns, could not resolve into a coherent threat assessment. Not because the humans were invisible, because they were illegible. Colton had spent the 40 minutes before the assembly reading the Keth engagement logs, and the specific thing he had been reading was not the tactical outcome, but the Zurani response time data. Every compact vessel that had engaged the Zurani in 11 days had been assessed, categorized, and countered within a consistent window. The assessment was fast, faster than any compact species' own tactical processing. But it required a minimum of coherent data to function. Incoherent data produced longer assessment windows. The debris field would give them incoherent data for 6 hours. 6 hours during which the Zurani Forward Command would be running an assessment that kept returning insufficient data confidence, trying to determine whether the 3 anomalous signatures in the Keth field were a threat, a probe, a diversion, or something else entirely. While they were running that assessment, they were not watching the other 36 species. At hour 4, Crane said, "The Volmari are moving." "I know," Colton said. "They're not following the autonomous action framework. They're moving in formation." "I know," Colton said. "Volmari can't help it. It's cultural. They'll be effective anyway. The Zurani will be splitting attention between us and them." A pause. "What else is moving?" Finch had been monitoring the compact traffic feeds. Aetheri, 2 vessels, heading toward the secondary Helios approach. Tharian destroyer group, 6 ships, no filed heading. She paused. Velthari, 8 warships, direct approach to the Zurani forward position. "Catan moved," Crane said, with the tone of someone revising an assumption. "He was always going to move," Colton said. "He just needed someone else to go first, so he wasn't the one setting the terms." He checked his display. "Where are we on the debris field exit?" 90 minutes, Finch said. "We'll clear into open space at the Helios corridor's southern approach. Then we have 90 minutes before the Zurani stops trying to figure out what we are and starts responding to everything else." He paused. "Make them count." What making them count meant, in practice, was continuing to be illegible for 90 more minutes, while the Zurani Forward Command's processing capacity was subdivided among 8 simultaneous threat assessments from 8 different species, moving in 8 different ways without coordination. The tactical model that had countered every compact response for 11 days was built for sequential problems: 1 species, 1 doctrine, 1 response pattern. It was encountering 14 species, doing 14 things simultaneously, none of which referenced any of the others. The assessment windows were lengthening, not because the Zurani model was inadequate, because it was running at the edge of its capacity for the first time. At hour 5, 40 minutes, the Zurani Forward Command made a decision that Colton had been waiting for. It withdrew its observation units from the debris field and repositioned them to address the Velthari approach, which was the largest and most conventional threat in the engagement space. "They've pulled back," Finch said. "Yes," Colton said. "Now we move." The 3 human vessels cleared the debris field at hour 6 and entered the Helios corridor's southern approach at a speed that the compact traffic systems flagged as inadvisable for that approach vector. They were not using the approach vector that the traffic systems expected. They were using the one that brought them directly alongside the Jurani communication relay cluster, the infrastructure backbone that connected the forward command to the systems they had taken over 11 days of careful, precise advance. It was not defended. The Jurani tactical model had assessed the southern approach as low priority because no compact species with military sense would use it. It was too exposed, too indirect, too inconsistent with any established doctrine. Hayes-Colton had not filed a doctrine. "Relay cluster in range," Crane said. "Targeting solutions locked." "Wait," Colton said. "Commander." "Wait. Let the Velthari engage first." He watched the display. 8 Velthari warships making direct contact with the Jurani forward position. Conventional, powerful, exactly what the Jurani tactical model had the most robust response protocols for. The model would be fully committed to that response in approximately 40 seconds. "Now," Colton said. The 3 human vessels fired simultaneously, not at the Jurani fleet, at the relay cluster, the communication infrastructure that connected 11 days of advance into a coherent operational whole. The strikes were precise, coordinated in the only moment of explicit coordination the human vessels had used in the entire engagement, and they were over in 9 seconds. The Jurani forward command went operationally silent. Not destroyed, isolated. Cut off from the systems it had taken, from the observation units it had deployed, from the tactical model updates that kept its responses current. A fleet that had operated with the precision of a system receiving continuous information became, in 9 seconds, a fleet operating on cached data in a rapidly changing engagement space. Crane said quietly, "That's the cascade." "That's the cascade," Colton confirmed. Parte 3 de 3. 11 juntos 60 palabras. The engagement lasted 4 more hours after the relay cluster went down, which was longer than it should have been and shorter than anyone had expected given the force disparity. The Jurani fleet, operating on cached data, was not helpless. 11 days of advance had given it significant positional advantage, and its individual vessel commanders were capable, independent of the central model. But independent capability was a different problem than synchronized precision, and the 14 species now moving through the engagement space were encountering something they had not encountered in 11 days. An opponent that was reacting rather than anticipating. Colton spent those 4 hours on the Starfall's command deck doing something that looked to his crew like not very much. He monitored the feeds. He tracked the positions. He said nothing for long stretches and then made brief, specific recommendations on the command channel that the other 2 vessels executed without asking why, because the preceding 6 hours had established a working assumption that the reasons were sound. At hour 2, he told Finch to move the pale horizon to a position that looked tactically irrelevant. 40 minutes later, a Jurani vessel that had been repositioning on cached data moved through that position and into the Volmari engagement envelope, where it was neutralized efficiently and with the particular satisfaction that the Volmari brought to problems they had been waiting to solve. At hour 3, he told Crane to hold the last signal completely still for 11 minutes, which was the kind of instruction that felt wrong in an active engagement and that Crane executed anyway. A Jurani tactical assessment running on degraded data classified the stationary vessel as damaged and non-threatening, and redirected response resources accordingly. The resources were redirected toward the Aetheri, who were ready for them. At hour 4, the Zerani Forward Command requested communication. Colton took the call. The voice that came through the channel was not what he had expected, not the flat, tactical communication of a system running combat protocols. A commander's voice, measured, specific, carrying the weight of someone who had just watched something they had built with considerable skill come apart in ways they hadn't designed for. "You disrupted the relay infrastructure," the Zerani commander said. "Yes," Colton said. "The advance was calculated on continuous communication. Without it, your model had to run on what it already knew instead of what was currently happening," Colton said. 11 days of perfect information, and then none. The gap between your cached data and the actual engagement space was the margin. A pause. "This was your plan from the assembly." "The outline of it," Colton said. "The details required seeing how you responded to the debris field. We assessed the debris field signatures as non-military." "Yes," Colton said. "That was the point." Another pause, longer. "You arrived at the assembly late, alone, without uniform." The voice carried something beneath the words, not accusation, something more like recalibration. "This was deliberate. Walking into a room full of military commands in civilian clothes with no attaché means everyone Jigay-1 decides immediately that you're not a serious threat," Colton said. "People who have decided you're not a serious threat, Jigay tell you things they wouldn't tell someone they were assessing." He paused. "I needed 40 minutes of Jigay materials while I loaded what they were actually worried about." A very long pause. "You are a strange species," the Zerani commander said finally. "Not as an insult, as a conclusion, GDK, Colton said. The terms of withdrawal were negotiated over the following 6 hours, which was standard compact procedure and involved people with more diplomatic training than Colton. He sat in the back of those sessions and did not speak, which several of the delegates found more unsettling than his participation would have been. The assembly debrief convened the following morning. Colton arrived on time, which seemed to surprise several people. Admiral Catan opened the session. "The engagement outcome is documented. The relay infrastructure disruption was decisive. The question before this assembly is how to assess what occurred and what it implies for compact joint doctrine going forward." He looked at Colton. "Commander, the autonomous action framework you proposed, in practice it was not fully autonomous. Several species coordinated informally. The Velthari advance was timed in relation to your relay strike." "I knew Catan would move when he had cover," Colton said. "I didn't coordinate with him. I designed a situation where his decision to move and my strike would coincide without us having to discuss it." He paused. "That's different from coordination. Coordination requires communication. This required understanding how someone thinks and creating conditions where their independent decision produces the outcome you need." Catan looked at him steadily. "You modeled our decision-making." "I've been reading compact political and military history for 11 years, Colton said. "Deck postings have long shifts. I had time." Dreskar said, "The human contribution to this engagement was 3 vessels and 1 officer without a uniform. The outcome was decisive. This assembly needs to understand how to replicate it." "You can't replicate it," Colton said. "That's the point." The Zerani model adapted to every coordinated response the compact tried, because coordinated responses are predictable. What you can do is stop trying to be predictable. He looked at the room. The compact spends considerable resources on joint doctrine because joint doctrine is efficient. It's also legible. Every species in this room fights in ways that can be studied, modeled, and countered. The reason the debris field approach worked is that there is no human doctrine to model. We improvise because we have 3 vessels and no resources for doctrine development. He paused. That's not a strategy, but it turned out to be useful. Varath said from the end of the table, "You're telling this assembly that your advantage was your limitation." "I'm telling this assembly that the Zurani spent 11 days building a perfect counter to how the compact fights," Colton said. "We don't fight like the compact. We showed up late, alone, in the wrong clothes, and went through the debris field because it was faster." He shrugged. They didn't have a model for that. The chamber was quiet. Catan looked at Colton for a long moment, with the 3-eyed attention that Colton had felt since the first session. The quality of observation that came from a very long military career encountering something genuinely outside its experience. "The human delegation," Catan said, "arrived late, alone, and without uniform. And won. We were also under-resourced, underprepared, and operating without authorization for most of what we did," Colton said. "I'd rather not make a habit of it." "And yet," Catan said. "And yet," Colton agreed. He filed his after-action report that evening in his quarters on the Starfall, with the Helios corridor visible through the viewport. Open again, traffic resuming, the 11-day advance already becoming something the compact would study and argue about for years. The report was brief. He had never been good at length. 3 vessels, 72 hours, 1 decisive strike on communication infrastructure. The engagement was won in the debris field, not at the relay cluster. The relay cluster was the outcome. The debris field was the decision. 6 hours of being something the enemy couldn't classify, buying time for 14 species to become 14 problems simultaneously. Recommend the compact invest in unpredictability as a strategic asset. Difficult to institutionalize. Potentially worth the difficulty. He sent it. Then he sat for a while with the viewport and the corridor and the specific quiet of a situation that had resolved in a direction it hadn't been required to resolve. His coffee was cold. He drank it anyway. Some things you prepared for. Some things you arrived at late, alone, wearing the wrong clothes, and figured out as you went. The gap between those 2 approaches was smaller than most military doctrine acknowledged, and larger than most commanders were comfortable admitting. Colton was comfortable admitting it. He had 3 vessels and a debris field, and 11 years of reading on long shifts, and it had been enough. This time.